You just got a 4% raise at work, and your boss called it a great year for the company, but your rent went up 7%, groceries cost way more than they used to, and that raise somehow feels like you're still losing ground. Why does every economic boom make wealthy people richer while your paycheck buys less every single year? Today, I'll explain who actually wins when the economy is doing well, like you're 5 years old. By the end, you'll understand why the system can be working perfectly fine while most people feel like they're falling behind. Here's what's happening. When economists and politicians say the economy is good, they're measuring specific things. Corporate profits, stock market performance, GDP growth, unemployment rates. And by those standards, the economy really is doing well right now. Profits are up. The S&P 500 keeps hitting records. Unemployment is historically low. But none of those measurements track whether you can afford your life. They don't measure grocery stress or rent anxiety or whether a medical bill would wipe you out. The economy is scored like a sports game where they only count points for one team. Think about it like this. Imagine your neighborhood throws a massive party and raises $100,000. Everyone contributed something, but when it's time to split the winnings, the 3 people who own houses get $80,000 to split between them. The other 50 people who just showed up and worked the event split the remaining $20,000. Technically, the party was a huge success. Record-breaking fundraiser. Everyone participated. But most people walk away with almost nothing, while a few people got rich. That's pretty much how modern economic growth works. Now here's what you need to understand. The economy rewards ownership way more than it rewards labor. If you own stocks, your wealth probably grew 20% last year. If you own real estate, your home value likely jumped. If you own a business, you probably had a strong year. But if you just work for a paycheck, your wages might have increased 3%, while your rent climbed 8%, food went up 11%, and car insurance basically doubled. You're not imagining things. You actually are falling behind, even during what experts call a strong economy. In 1980, the average CEO made about 42 times what their typical worker earned. Today, that ratio is over 350 to 1. Not because CEOs work 350 times harder, but because CEO pay is tied to stock performance, and stock values have exploded while wages barely moved. Meanwhile, corporate profits as a share of GDP are at near record highs. Companies are making more money than ever. They're just not sharing it with the people doing the actual work. When Apple or Amazon post record profits, do warehouse workers or retail employees see their pay triple? Of course not. The gains flow upward to executives and shareholders. But here's where it gets interesting. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. Modern capitalism is built to maximize returns for shareholders and asset owners. That's literally the goal. When a company does well, the profits flow to investors first. Workers get what's left over, and only if the company feels generous or faces pressure. You're not failing at the game. You're just playing a game where the rules favor people who already have money to invest. Let's talk about who specifically benefits from this setup. First, wealthy households. The top 10% of Americans own roughly 87% of all stocks. When the stock market soars, their wealth grows automatically while they sleep. They didn't work harder. They just owned things that increased in value. Second, people who own real estate. Home values have exploded in most markets. If you bought a house 10 years ago, you're probably sitting on massive gains. But if you're trying to buy now, you're locked out by prices that climbed faster than wages ever could. Third, corporations with pricing power. When costs go up, big companies can just raise prices and protect their margins. They pass inflation directly to you. But when you ask for a raise to keep up with those higher prices, you're told the budget is tight. Companies can inflate their way to higher profits. Workers can't inflate their way to higher wages. The power imbalance is built into the structure. Here's something that'll surprise you. Even employment numbers hide what's really happening. Yes, unemployment is low. But that stat doesn't measure quality of jobs. It counts someone working 3 part-time gigs with no benefits, the same as someone with a stable career. It doesn't track whether your job pays enough to afford rent in the city where that job exists. It doesn't measure whether you're one medical emergency away from bankruptcy. Low unemployment sounds great until you realize it just means most people are working. not that most people are thriving. You could work 60 hours a week across multiple jobs and still qualify as food insecure. The unemployment rate wouldn't capture that struggle at all. Now check this out. Worker productivity has increased roughly 62% since 1979. Wages only grew about 17% in that same period. Workers are producing way more value per hour than they used to, but they're taking home a smaller share of the value they create. That extra productivity went somewhere. It went to profits, to shareholders, to executives, to stock buybacks and dividends. The economy is growing, you're just not invited to the growth. This means if your parents or grandparents could afford a house and raise kids on one income in 1979, you should be able to do it even more easily today based on productivity alone. But the opposite is true. This affects your daily life in ways you might not connect. Why is housing so expensive? Because real estate became an investment vehicle for wealthy people and corporations instead of just a place to live. Private equity firms now own hundreds of thousands of single-family homes, competing against regular families and driving up prices. Why do groceries cost so much? Because a handful of companies control most food production and distribution, and they have pricing power you don't. Why does healthcare bankrupt people? Because the system prioritizes profit over care, and you can't exactly shop around when you're having a heart attack. Even the solutions are designed around ownership. Politicians talk about growing the economy, but growth mainly benefits people who own assets. They talk about the importance of investing, but most people can barely cover rent and groceries. They suggest building wealth through home ownership, but homes cost 6 times what they used to relative to income. The advice assumes you already have extra money to invest. For millions of people, that assumption is ridiculous. Here's the part nobody says out loud. The economy can keep posting great numbers forever, while regular people struggle harder every year. Because the economy and your personal financial reality are measuring completely different things. One tracks total wealth creation. The other tracks whether you can afford your life. Those two things used to move together. They don't anymore. And that's not an accident. It's a choice about how we structure society. So what would it look like if we measured differently? Instead of celebrating record stock markets, what if we tracked how many full-time workers can afford rent in their city? Instead of cheering GDP growth, what if we measured whether families can afford childcare and healthcare? Instead of focusing on unemployment rates, what if we tracked job quality and wage growth relative to cost of living? The economy might look very different. We might discover we're actually in a crisis even while the Dow Jones hits all-time highs. This matters because how we measure success shapes what policies we pursue. If we only care about growth and profits, we get exactly what we have now. But if we measured economic health by whether ordinary people are thriving, we'd probably make very different choices about minimum wages, corporate taxes, healthcare, housing policy, and worker protections. The economy is working great. The question is who it's working for. So to recap, the economy is measured by profits, markets, and GDP growth, not by whether you can afford groceries. It rewards ownership over labor, and most people only have their labor to sell. The top 10% own 87% of stocks, so market gains flow to people who are already wealthy. Productivity is up 62% since 1979, but wages only grew 17%. Housing, food, and healthcare are expensive because the system prioritizes profit over affordability, and we keep measuring success by metrics that ignore whether regular people are actually okay. So here's the real question. Should we keep judging the economy by stock prices and corporate profits, or should we measure it by whether a full-time job can actually support a full-time life?